My name is Roy Harris, Roy J. Harris Jr., as my father was also Roy Harris. I spent a career of about 45 years in the journalism business, starting in 1971. After my graduation from Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism, I began work with the Wall Street Journal. Worked at the Wall Street Journal from 1971 until 1994, the end of 1994. Then went to work in the Economist organization with CFO magazine, which at the time was owned by the Economist and is based in Boston, Massachusetts, where Boston area is where I live now. I began my career while still in high school working for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in my hometown. My father had worked for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch for 42 years, so it was natural for me to move into that business and also into that newspaper. After working summers as a reporter for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and going to Medill at Northwestern, I then began work in journalism at the Los Angeles Times, which is where I was when I got the call to enter the Army. And I was in the Armed Services and the Army for 2 years serving in West Germany at the time. So I got very interested in the Pulitzer Prizes in the year 2002 while I was at CFO magazine. And I went to St. Louis to do a presentation on the 100th anniversary, what would have been the 100th anniversary of my father's birth. He died in 1980, so this was 2002. On September 9th, 2002, his birthday, I did a presentation about the Pulitzer Prizes that his newspaper and my first newspaper, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, had won over the years, specifically 1937 to 1952. And that presentation got me deeply interested in doing research about the Pulitzer Prizes, which led to what is now my post-retirement career, having written a book called Pulitzer's Gold about the 100 years of public service Pulitzer Prizes awarded by the Pulitzer Organization at Columbia University in New York. The newest edition of that book came out just this year, 2016, and accompanies the centennial of the Pulitzer Prizes. So it covers those first 99 years. The 100th awarding of the Pulitzer Prizes will be April 18th, 2016, and I will be watching carefully. In addition to having written the book, I also follow the Pulitzer Prizes regularly for the Poynter Institute and their Poynter Online news operation. And each year since about 2003, I've done a Pulitzer Prize preview, letting journalists know what kinds of things might be awarded the Pulitzer Prize, talking a little bit about how the Pulitzer Prizes operate. And I'll be doing that again this year for the Poynter Institute. It's gotten to be a terrific association serving journalists and informing journalists by telling them about how the Pulitzer Prizes work. When I began researching the public service Pulitzer Prizes around 2002, I found that there was actually very little that had been written about the public service Pulitzer Prizes as a group of awards. There had been books written about Pulitzer Prizes for editorial writing and some of the other Pulitzer Prizes, but for various reasons, as I discovered later, it's quite a difficult topic to research. It mainly has to do with Pulitzer Prizes that are won by teams of journalists. In the early years, there was very, very little history done of those Pulitzer Prizes or of the Pulitzer Prize organization itself. So I had to ground myself in that. And this was my first book, Pulitzer's Gold, which originally came out in 2008 from University of Missouri Press. And so I found in doing that research, spending time at Columbia University where the files are kept, and interviewing as many as I could find of Pulitzer Prize winners in that category from the earliest years, some going back as far as 1936, which was quite a thrill to find journalists who had been involved with the Pulitzer Prizes back in 1936. I found that really there were very few other people who had that kind of interest in the Public Service Pulitzer Prize, and all of a sudden people started calling me and asking me about my expertise, especially around the time when the Pulitzer Prizes were awarded. Having written a book, and the only book really on the Public Service Pulitzer Prizes, makes one an expert. That is, assuming the book is a decent one and is true to journalistic profession, and mine was. I tried to use all of the talents that I developed at the Wall Street Journal to try and write a book that was that made these stories very interesting to learn about. The respect that I had for these Pulitzer Prize winners is very, very deep, and I tried to translate that as well into the book as I wrote it. I also have a very deep family association with the Pulitzer Prizes, in that my father, Roy J. Harris, who died in 1980, was involved with 4 Public Service Pulitzer Prizes. Pretty amazing grand total, actually, when you think of it. From 1937 to 1950, including 1 Pulitzer Prize that actually has his name on the citation. In most cases, the Public Service Pulitzer Prize, in all situations, the Public Service Pulitzer Prize is awarded to a publication, to a news organization, not to an individual. But in some cases, the individuals who contributed to that prize, who were instrumental in the prize-winning work, is mentioned in the citation, and generally that individual is then considered to be a Pulitzer Prize winner, even though he or she is part of the team. So my father was involved with 4 Public Service Pulitzer Prizes, and he is considered a Pulitzer Prize winner specifically because of the 1950 Pulitzer Prize, where he and one other reporter from the Chicago Daily News, my father was working for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch at the time, uncovered in the state capital, the Illinois state capital of Springfield, the fact that a large number of newspaper editors were also on the state payroll, doing double duty in what was considered a huge ethical violation, to be paid by the state and to also be a member of the press. And when that was disclosed, it became something of a national scandal. And this was in 1949, those stories first appeared. The first story appeared on April 14th, 1949, in both the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and the Chicago Daily News. And in May of 1950, the Post-Dispatch and the Chicago Daily News were awarded the Pulitzer Prize in Public Service, and my father's name and the name of the Chicago Daily News reporter, George Thieme, were on the citation, so they are considered Pulitzer Prize winners. As you can imagine, that got me very deeply involved in some of the lore of the Pulitzer Prizes, although I was only 2.5 years old when my dad wrote those stories, and slightly older, when like 3, when he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize. It's been a part of my family history, and definitely lent itself to the background for my deciding to learn about the Public Service Pulitzer Prize and eventually to produce the book Pulitzer's Gold. In researching the Public Service Pulitzer Prizes, again, my first book, I was amazed at what I learned about the Pulitzer Prizes and how they started, and what they reported in their early years, what they awarded prizes for in their early years. And it was quite surprising to me to find the depth of interest that the Pulitzer Prizes had in acknowledging work that was done by newspapers in the South and in the Midwest as early as the late 1910s. The first Pulitzer Prize was awarded in 1917. And within several years, the Pulitzer Prizes had acknowledged publications and reporters who had reported deeply into scandals involving racial hatred, the Ku Klux Klan, lynchings, I was amazed to find out how early in American history, in 1919s and early 1920s, that attention was being paid nationally through the awarding of the Pulitzer Prize to the courageous work that was done by reporters and editors to expose criminality from the standpoint of vigilantes acting on racial hatred. The pillars of the Pulitzers, one of them is social justice, I believe, looking at such things as exposing racial hatred, criminality related to that, like vigilantism. Also, governmental abuse and criminality, another one of the pillars of the Pulitzers. The work of a publication in serving the community during times of disaster is another one of the pillars. Numerous cases through the years when a community has been imperiled and has relied on the news organization to speak up for it and inform it and help it survive. That ranges all the way from the dust storms, the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, all the way to Hurricane Katrina, which we know about from the year 2005, which won for 2 newspapers the Public Service Pulitzer Prize in 2006. And we can include under those disasters the September 11th, 2001 disaster in New York and Washington, D.C., committed by terrorists who flew planes into the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington. The work that was done by journalists in terms of the Public Service Pulitzer Prize, the New York Times, became a major part of the book and also represented that one of those pillars, the pillar of helping a community at a time of disaster. So it informed me of how broad the Public Service Pulitzer Prize was. Only one is given in a typical year, one Public Service Pulitzer Prize. There are 14 today Pulitzer Prizes in journalism categories, but only one is the Public Service Pulitzer Prize, unless they make a rare exception and award that prize to 2 publications. It's the only prize that is awarded in the form of the Pulitzer Gold Medal called the Joseph Pulitzer Medal. And while that medal has come to represent the Pulitzer Prizes overall, there is only one awarded every year, or again, 2 if there are 2 winners. As I began my research on the Public Service Pulitzer Prize for the book Pulitzer's Gold, I drew on my family knowledge of the Joseph Pulitzer family. Having grown up in St. Louis, I was born and raised in St. Louis and started work at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, my father's newspaper. The Pulitzer family owned the St. Louis Post-Dispatch at the time. It was Joseph Pulitzer's first connection with journalism when he put together the newspapers, started the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. He was a Hungarian immigrant, fought for a time on the northern side in the Civil War, but he was very dedicated to the idea of quality journalism of a kind that really didn't exist in the United States. He was a great believer in community service, in uncovering wrongdoing. In fact, I thought, as I began to get into why the Pulitzer Prizes were created, how they were created, I thought it might be valuable to understand a little bit about what Joseph Pulitzer believed. While I couldn't find any evidence that he had a particular interest in exposing racial hatred, as we'll see, the Pulitzer Prizes from a very early point did do that. But Joseph Pulitzer himself was a great believer in exposing wrongdoing, and I thought it might be valuable to read just a brief statement of what Joseph Pulitzer's beliefs were. You'll hear in this reading that he's not talking specifically about racial hatred, but it gives a sense of what it was that he wanted his editors to do in his publications. The 2 publications associated with him, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in St. Louis and the New York World, which he started somewhat later in New York. So here's a statement that he wrote, a brief statement that he wrote at his retirement as editor of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And as I began working at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. I knew this statement because it was etched in the stone of the walls of the lobby of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. So it had particular meaning for me, and perhaps it'll give an idea of just what it was that Joseph Pulitzer was after when he decided to start his Pulitzer Prizes. This was written April 10th, 1907. It's called the Joseph Pulitzer Platform for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. I know that my retirement will make no difference in its cardinal principles, that it will always fight for progress and reform, never tolerate injustice or corruption, always fight demagogues of all parties, never belong to any party, always oppose privileged classes and public plunderers, never lack sympathy with the poor, always remain devoted to the public welfare, never be satisfied with merely printing news, always be drastically independent, never be afraid to attack wrong, whether by predatory plutocracy or predatory poverty. So that was the inscription on the lobby wall of the newspaper where I started and where my dad worked for 42 years, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And when I began to research the Pulitzer Prizes, I found that that principle that was his guiding light and that he made the guiding light for his editors and reporters really also was something that I think was infused in his brainstorm of setting up a system of awards for journalism. Interestingly enough, as I began to do this research, I found that the Pulitzer Prizes were quite a breakthrough in terms of being an annual award. At that time, of course, there were no Oscars and no Emmys. There was no other really annual award except for the Nobel Prizes, which were a global award. So when Joseph Pulitzer dreamed up this idea of having annual awards, his plan was that journalists, for the first time, would be acknowledged for the very best of their work. He set this up in a draft of his will. When he died in 1911, his will went into force, and by 1916, a system of awards was set up, governed by Columbia University, and they were the Pulitzer Prizes. For the work in the year 1916, those prizes were first awarded in 1917 by a board that had been set up at Columbia University, a board of editors from newspapers. At the time, there were no radio stations or TV stations. It was just newspapers. And a board of editors got together and acted on nominations that had been made to select the first Pulitzer Prize winners. In that first year, there were only 3 Pulitzer Prizes for journalism. Joseph Pulitzer had decided to also honor work in the American arts as well as American journalism. But in journalism, there were only 3 awards for that first year, and only 2 of them were given out. There was no award in his premier category, which was public service. So I began to get rooted in all of this. And what was amazing to me was to find out that Joseph Pulitzer's awards, very, very early on in American history, 1917, 1918, 1919, began to acknowledge courageous work done by newspaper editors and newspaper reporters, including in the area of speaking up for social justice and opposing racial hatred. My first encounter with that was the Pulitzer Prize given in 1922 to the New York World. Again, that was Joseph Pulitzer's own newspaper, but Joseph Pulitzer had been dead for 11 years when the newspaper won that award. That award was given for the extraordinary front page coverage that was produced by the New York World to expose the Ku Klux Klan and its operations all around the country, predominantly in the South, but also in the Midwest and in the North. A journalist, an editor at that paper, Herbert Bayard Swope was instrumental in assigning reporters to learn everything they could about the Ku Klux Klan and to show what hatred dominated the Klan, and also how financial abuses were involved with it, that it was largely set up as a money-raising operation based on hatred of blacks and hatred of Jews and hatred of Catholics. And terrible vigilante crimes were committed against these people all around the U.S., especially in the South. Amazingly, the New York World was able to expose all of these things. They went into depth talking about people hiding behind the mask. They exposed secret passwords. They identified people by name who had been hiding their identities behind a mask. And it was a series of articles that, from my view, really kind of set the tone for that one pillar of the Pulitzer Prizes, looking at racial hatred. The very next year after that 1922 award to the New York World for exposing the Ku Klux Klan on the front pages of that newspaper, again went to a publication that exposed the Ku Klux Klan. In this case, exposed it in its own home state, and this was Memphis, the Commercial Appeal. I'll take a look at the note here. That award was given for its courageous attitude in the publication of cartoons and the handling of news in reference to the operations of the Ku Klux Klan. And it was thrilling for me to be able to research these stories for my book, Pulitzer's Gold, because it showed that, that there was so much attention being paid to what generally was not written about in most American publication. The Ku Klux Klan was considered a very secretive organization. Yet here was a case in Memphis where editors in a state where Ku Klux Klan members actually were infecting government, that these people at the Memphis Commercial Appeal exposed these individuals. They were subjected to a lot of abuse. It would continue to happen at other local newspapers in the South that reported on the Ku Klux Klan, but Memphis certainly did suffer abuse because of that. The Memphis Commercial Appeal did. Another one I will note was 1926. The Columbus Enquirer-Sun in Columbus, Georgia, a relatively small town, was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for public service for the service which it rendered in its brave and energetic fight against the Ku Klux Klan, against the enactment of a law barring the teaching of evolution, against dishonest and incompetent public officials, and for justice to the Negro, and against lynching. So that was a combination award in Public Service Pulitzer Prize, actually quite rare in the history of this one award, that acknowledged clearly a strong position in the anti-Ku Klux Klan movement, but in Columbus, Georgia, that was quite a bold kind of position for a news organization to take. And the Pulitzer Board clearly wanted to acknowledge this nationally, that this kind of courage would be honored with the Pulitzer Prize if it were done at a very high level. That was 1926. I also note that in 1928, the Indianapolis Times won for exposing government corruption in the state, and that prize to the Indianapolis paper was also had a Ku Klux Klan connection, because the governor of the state at the time and the former Secretary of State both had been deeply involved with the Ku Klux Klan, and the newspaper exposed that in their reporting. So it was amazing to me, as I was researching all these different prizes that were won, how often it was that the Pulitzer organization acknowledged this work done by Southern newspapers and Midwestern newspapers to expose what clearly the journalists in the Pulitzer organization saw as a terrible, terrible wrong, and another case of essentially attacking poor people and people who did not have a voice. they found a voice in the editors of these publications and also in the national organization of the Pulitzer Prizes that honored this work with the Public Service Award. Amazing to me, but once I began to find this happening in the 20s, I was not surprised when I found out that even leading into the 40s and 50s and 60s, when the civil rights movement became a major part of the United States history, that the Pulitzer Prizes were also there. And while they were honoring great journalism of all different kinds, when there was a need to honor publications for their courageous action to speak up for minorities and to speak up for enforcement of the law, the Pulitzer Prizes were usually there to honor the publication that had done that work. While the Pulitzer Prizes were acknowledging newspapers that had made racial justice a theme, it was really in the 1950s that we began to see some of the work that was done by journalists kind of running ahead of American history. The 1950s were a time, obviously, when we had major Supreme Court rulings, desegregating the schools, and also great attention being paid to demonstrations, freedom riders, and newspapers were there covering that. In most cases, well, in all cases, we would find that the Pulitzer Prizes were awarded to more establishment publications, certainly the white press. The black press had never really been acknowledged by the Pulitzer Prizes, and there were no black members of the Pulitzer Board at the time. It has since become an extremely diverse group with members of all minorities, really, represented, and both in the Pulitzer Prize Board that makes the final award and in the juries that are part of this two-part system of deciding the Pulitzer Prizes. But back in the 50s, it was really left to these senior editors of publications around the country to speak up for the journalism that was being done by these publications, one run by white editors and by white reporters. And until very late in the Pulitzer Prize history, there were no black newspapers that were recognized. So when we get into the 50s, there's one amazing case that crops up that I want to cover here in speaking with you. I'll just read a note about the Arkansas, starting with North Carolina. The Whiteville News Reporter and Tabor City Tribune were awarded the Public Service Prize in 1953. They had written articles in 1952 that, as the Pulitzer Prize Board put it, successfully campaigned against the Ku Klux Klan. They waged on their own doorstep, at the risk of economic loss and personal danger, this campaign against the Ku Klux Klan, and that campaign culminated in the conviction of over 100 Klansmen and an end to terrorism in their communities. I haven't mentioned this, but it's also true that the Public Service Pulitzer Prize specifically is geared to note accomplishments by publication. It's not true of all the different awards, but in public service, the board, when making that award, is looking for some change, some governmental change. In the case of exposing criminality, somebody indicted or who goes to jail. In the case of the North Carolina newspapers, that activity was culminating in the conviction of over 100 Klansmen and an end to terrorism in their communities. I'm not sure it was accurate to say that terrorism ended in North Carolina, but certainly people going to jail was an important element in the Public Service Award being awarded in that year. The two editors of those publications were quite celebrated at the time and received national publicity because of the Pulitzer Prize. I think they were even part of an Edward R. Murrow program. And it also sent a signal to journalists all across the country that the Pulitzer Prizes were watching that kind of story, that kind of courage on the part of editors and reporters. and that it would be acknowledged when that courage was displayed in the pages of newspapers. We certainly saw that several years later in a case in Little Rock, Arkansas, and I'll read something about that. In 1957, of course, Little Rock was desegregated under Brown versus Board of Education, and as we remember from history, Governor Orville Faubus of Arkansas called out the National Guard and stopped the integration of Central High School in Little Rock. The Arkansas Gazette and its editor, Harry Ashmore, were instrumental in informing the community about what Governor Faubus was doing, about what the law of the land was, and editorially, Harry Ashmore challenged the people of Little Rock to acknowledge that to stop integration of the schools was a violation of the law, and that its community would be acting illegally, including the governor, would be acting illegally if they tried to prevent that desegregation. It was an amazing act of courage, printing a front page editorial. It sounds maybe normal today to say people should obey the law, but at the time that was a rather radical statement in the city of Little Rock. Harry Ashmore, for what he wrote and what his newspaper wrote, urging Governor Faubus to change his course and urging the people to support the desegregation of schools, which had been made the law of the land. Harry Ashmore was awarded the editorial page Pulitzer Prize that next year, 1958, and the newspaper also was awarded the Public Service Prize. It was the only case, really, where the same publication won the editorial writing award and the Public Service Prize. That showed that the Pulitzer Board at the time thought this was an extraordinary achievement to speak up for the community, to look after the welfare of its poorest citizens, to speak up for racial justice, and I think it's probably one of the highest moments for the Pulitzer Prizes and certainly for the Pulitzer Prize Public Service Award. So after 1958, Pulitzer Prizes, not surprisingly, remained very, very active in watching what was going on among publications in covering civil rights. It was the huge story of the 1960s, of course. There were no public service awards given out then, but a large number of very eloquent editorials written by Southern editors were honored with editorial writing prizes for those editors, indicating that the Pulitzer organization continued to be deeply involved with how the press was covering this major strain in American history. It'd be nice from the standpoint of my book if a public service Pulitzer Prize had been honored had honored someone for this work, but I leave that to the people who write about editorial page winners to describe. The Pulitzers spent their time giving public service awards for other major public services in the 1960s and 1970s. Early 1970s, we have the Pentagon Papers honored with the Public Service Pulitzer Prize, going to the New York Times. The next year, Washington Post won for its disclosures about the Watergate abuses. So the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service continued to do yeoman duty, acknowledging great journalism. But we do find that racial themes continue to come up for the Public Service Prize. In 1994, the Akron Beacon Journal did an amazing series of stories on explaining, analyzing racial issues in the state of Ohio and in Akron. And they were awarded it was in 1993 that they wrote these stories. In 1994, they received the Public Service Pulitzer Prize, which is also mentioned in a book, of course. for its broad examination of local racial attitudes and its subsequent effort to promote improved communication in the community. Often, the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service is acknowledging racial themes even when the story itself is much broader than just race. One case of that would be in 2012, when the Public Service Pulitzer Prize went to the Philadelphia Inquirer for a series of stories that it did in 2011 looking at school violence. It wasn't intended to be a racial story. It was intended to be a story of violence in the public schools, but it did focus on some of the schools where poorer black students went, and certainly was a story that helped inform the community about what was really going on in education, the discipline problems in schools, and it was a fascinating study that certainly belongs, I think, being considered as a social justice kind of story. Another story honored with the Public Service Pulitzer Prize was several years later. The 2015 prize went to the Charleston, South Carolina Post and Courier for an amazing series that they had done in the prior year. It would be 2014. One that fascinated me as someone who is a journalist writing for journalists as well as non-journalists in my book Pulitzer's Gold was to look at how the editors got into this story. For years, the editors of this newspaper in South Carolina have been writing a little news brief about the high number of South Carolina women who were killed by their spouses or significant others. And they didn't know what to do with that exactly. They were number one on the list of 50 states in terms of women who were killed by their partners. And that year, in 2014, the editors decided, let's look more deeply into this and find out why this is the case. And they devoted a terrific, they put a terrific team of reporters and an editor on the case to find out what the various characteristics were. They found that there was a religious element in that often there was a view that it was believed to be a religious view that women were the possession of the men in their lives. There was a heavy gun component in that 70% of the people of the women were killed by handguns. And as they put all this together, they found that there were reasons that the citizens, the readers of the Post and Courier, should know about why this was the case, that as it turned out, one woman every 12 days in South Carolina was killed by her significant other. When they reported this story, they got a terrific reaction all around the country. In this case, I thought phenomenally, because they had put this story out online before they put it in print. I mention this because it's indicative of some really major changes that we all know are going on in the news business now that is also reflected in the Pulitzer Prizes. Pulitzer Prizes are now recognizing not just newspapers, of course, but also magazines and online publications. And I think they're moving in the direction of being the premier honor for journalism of all kinds. Before long, I suspect we'll be seeing great social justice journalism that's covered on television and on radio also be part of the Pulitzer Prizes. I don't make the decision, but I'll certainly be writing about it when those decisions are made. They have recently expanded. Instead of being only newspapers, they're now also magazines in a number of categories. So the future is going to hold a continuation of this kind of social justice reporting being honored by the Pulitzer Prizes, but they'll be honored in a far more diverse group of publications, including a lot of online. And I think we can look forward to the Pulitzer Prizes standing up for this kind of courage in the journalism community moving forward from